Is Robert Nozick's experience machine objection successful against ethical hedonism, or, if you prefer, ethical hedonism? In this video, I'm going to argue, following an argument from the philosopher Fred Feldman, that it is not successful as an objection against ethical hedonism. So let's start with what the experience machine objection actually says. So you have to imagine, it's a thought experiment. Imagine you are in a situation where you have the opportunity to go into a machine, the experience machine, and it will stimulate your brain in such a way as to simulate any experience you like. Any desire, any experience that you want fulfilled could be fulfilled. You can have the experience of it, and it will feel like real life. It will feel like you're actually doing the thing that you think you're doing, but actually you're just floating around in a tank plugged into the machine. As a result, you can lead in the machine a much more pleasurable life than you otherwise would outside of the machine. And so what Nozick appears to be saying, because it's not clear that he's actually arguing against ethical hedonism, it's not entirely clear exactly what he's arguing, really, but it's often taken as an argument against ethical hedonism, so this is important. What he appears to say is, despite the fact that you would have a more pleasurable life in the machine than outside the machine, you still wouldn't want to plug in to the machine forever. You'd still prefer real life. And he gives various reasons for these. One is that you want to be a certain person, right? You want to be compassionate or be courageous, not just have the experience of those things. You want to actually, develop your character. And the other is that we want our experiences to be in contact with reality, right? Not just sort of pretend in our head. Ethical hedonism, remember, is the position that basically says that the only thing of intrinsic value is pleasure. Another way of putting that is to say that our welfare or our well-being is composed of experiences of pleasure and nothing else. The way Feldman defines ethical hedonism is the view that a person's welfare is directly proportional to the amount of sensory pleasure minus pain that he experiences. So the idea is, if ethical hedonism is true, then really we should go into the experience machine, because the experience machine is going to give us a life with a higher amount of pleasure and a minimal amount of pain. Feldman presents Nozick's argument in this step-by-step formula, so let's have a look at that. And this may look pretty scary at first, so let's just break it down, because it's actually quite simple. So what the argument is basically saying here is just simply that although life in the machine produces greater pleasure than real life, the fact that you would not plug in, this means that life in the machine does not produce greater welfare than actual life, that you actually get more welfare in actual life than life in the machine, despite the fact that life in the machine produces more pleasure. So therefore, a person's welfare is not proportional to the amount of pleasure minus pain that they experiences, and therefore ethical hedonism is false. To see what is problematic about Nozick's argument, we have to look at premise 2. Now, premise 2 is an if-then statement. It's saying that if one is true, so if it is true that in the Nozick scenario you wouldn't plug in, if that is true, then that means that life in the machine does not have greater welfare value than real life. Now, the problem with this is that there's a whole myriad of reasons as to why you may not plug in, and these reasons may have absolutely nothing to do with value, pleasure, or welfare. And if you don't plug in for that sort of reason, then we can actually draw the conclusion that life in the machine is not of greater welfare value than actual life. If the reason you're not plugging in has nothing to do with welfare. For example, one reason why you might be reluctant to plug in might actually be because you are unconvinced that it's going to work. You may be worried that it won't work. What if you end up in a living nightmare for the rest of your life plugged into the machine? Right? How do you know it's going to work? So these are problems about what you know and what you can't know. So we can call these epistemic difficulties. So there are various epistemic difficulties that might make you not want to plug in. This is how premise 2 fails, because we can't draw the conclusion that premise 2 wants to draw because of this reason, because there's all these other reasons why you might be reluctant not to plug in. But we can solve that, and we can solve that by plugging various conditions into the first premise. So what we need to rule out the possibility that the reason you're not plugging in is to do with epistemic difficulties. We need to rule that out and make sure that's not the reason, so that we can draw the conclusions we want to draw about welfare. So to do that, we just fix premise 2 like this. So we just put in the simple condition that if you were in the Nozick scenario and you know beyond doubt that life in the experience machine would be more pleasant than actual life, still you would not plug in to get life in the machine. And then if one is true, if that's true, then life in the machine does not have greater welfare value than actual life. Now that is more plausible because we know that it's all going to work, but you still wouldn't plug in. So it's more plausible now that we can draw conclusions about welfare. But there are still other possibilities, other reasons why you wouldn't plug in. So we need to make sure that we account for all of those. For instance, another reason might be moral issues. There may be moral reasons as to why you don't plug into the machine. So for instance, I have moral obligations to family and to friends that I can't fulfill if I'm plugged in, floating around in a tank plugged into the experience machine, right? So I'd have to default on these moral obligations. And as a result, I might think it's immoral for me to plug in to the machine. So how are we going to fix that? The way Feldman does that is he adds the condition that the subject of the experiment is welfare selfish. And this just means that he cares only about his own welfare, not about his moral welfare. So now the argument looks a bit like this. So, we're saying, it's going to work. You're completely welfare selfish, but despite the fact that you're completely welfare selfish and it's going to work, you still don't plug in. Now, if that was the case, if you still would not plug in, then we can then make a claim about greater welfare. So you see what we're doing here. For Nozick's argument to succeed, it's not enough to say if you're in that scenario, you wouldn't plug in, therefore we can draw the conclusion that ethical hedonism is false. It's not enough to do that because there may be so many other reasons why you wouldn't plug in that have nothing to do with welfare. So what we're doing is we're having a look at what those other reasons are, and they're basically plugging the gap there by inserting conditions into premise 1 that will therefore make premise 2 more plausible. There are a couple more things that we could do. Feldman looks at 2 other reasons. So he also mentions not plugging in for the reason that you find the idea repugnant or you find it unnatural. And the fourth reason he gives is a slightly more complicated. Fourth reason that you might not plug in is actually you don't believe that ethical hedonism is true. You're committed to some other theory about welfare. So the offer that you could have a more pleasurable existence in the experiment machine doesn't appeal to you because you don't think that's what constitutes welfare anyway. So we can easily account for the idea that you wouldn't plug in because you find it unnatural or icky by saying that you're fully rational, right? So you're not going to be swayed by the idea that it's just a bit strange going into the machine. You're fully rational. If you want what's best for you, and if the experience machine is best for you, you're likely to do it. The second claim is a little bit more complicated. You might not plug in because you don't believe in ethical hedonism. We can't simply say that the person does believe in ethical hedonism because that would completely collapse the argument. If the person believes in ethical hedonism, then they are going to plug in. That's not what we're trying to make sure. We're trying to give this argument its best chance, not completely collapse it. So we can't simply say that. And if they don't believe in ethical hedonism, that again is going to make premise 2 less plausible because the reason they're not going to plug in is because they don't believe in ethical hedonism. So to solve that, Feldman he says that the subject in the experiment, they are axiologically insightful. Axiology is the study of value. So axiologically insightful. What that basically means is that the subject in the experiment, they prefer one life over another if the one is actually better for him than the other. And this rules out the possibility that they refuse to plug in simply because they're committed to some anti-hedonistic theory of welfare. Now that we've done that, the argument looks like this. Premise 2 now looks a lot more satisfactory than it did. We've made it so that every rationale for choosing the less good life has been, whatever that is, has been ruled out. So if someone who only cares about their own welfare, they're adequately knowledgeable, they're perfectly rational, and they're committed to choosing, preferring the life that is better for them than the other, and they still would choose real life over life in the machine, then we then have good grounds for saying that, well, okay, fine, actually, real life has better welfare value than life in the machine, and therefore ethical hedonism is false. But here is the big problem now. So while we have made premise 2 more plausible, by doing that, we've lost plausibility of premise 1. Premise 1 has become less plausible. This is because we no longer, the argument has changed slightly. We no longer have this vague claim that, if you're in the scenario, you would not plug in. We don't care what you would do, right? When we had the argument like that, it didn't work because there were so many reasons why you might not plug in that said nothing to do. That had no implications for how we would value the welfare in each scenario. To save the argument, what we needed to know is not what you would do, but what a welfare, selfish, knowledgeable, rational person, etc., what they would do. The problem is that it's now entirely open to the hedonist to say, well, actually, premise 1 is just not plausible anymore. because they would say, since pleasure is good, such a person as described, a person that once prefers the life that's better for them, they're welfare selfish, they're knowledgeable, and all of the things that we said, fully rational, such a person would plug in. They simply would plug in, and they would deny that the subject in that scenario wouldn't plug in. So ethical. So now to save premise 2, we had to beef up premise 1, but by doing that, we've actually made premise 1 less plausible, and now it's open to serious challenge by the ethical hedonist. And so this is why the argument fails, because either premise 2 fails or premise 1 fails, but they can all succeed. And so Nozick's, so this is Feldman's argument that Nozick's experience machine objection fails as an argument against ethical hedonism.